Throughout the 1960s, Triumph was unusual in persisting with the separate chassis for many of its cars, such as the Herald and Spitfire, along with the TR4, 5 and 6. But in 1965, the company came up with something much more modern, featuring monocoque construction, and that was the two-seater Fury. Powered by the same 2-litre straight six as many of Triumph's production cars, and styled by the company's favoured designer Giovanni Michelotti, the Fury looked like a modernised Spitfire, but it was bigger and featured a completely different construction. Potentially sitting between the Spitfire and TR, the Fury could have done really well for Triumph, but the company just couldn't afford to put it into production. As a result, just the one prototype was built, and this is it. Michelotti had started working on a freelance basis for Standard Triumph as early as the mid-50s. He was first commissioned to design the complete car in 1957. That car would be the Triumph Herald, and once that had been launched in 1959, the commissions came thick and fast. Michelotti would style every Triumph of the 60s and 70s, apart from the Carman-designed TR6. The monocoque construction MGB Roadster had been introduced in 1962, and 2 years later Triumph's Harry Webster reckoned that his company should be producing something equally modern. In November 1964, the brief was given to Michelotti to come up with a two-seater sports car, which would feature unitary construction and Triumph's familiar standard Vanguard-derived 2-litre straight-six engine. It took Michelotti just 3 months to come up with a sensationally styled two-seater Roadster, which looked essentially like a facelifted Triumph Spitfire, which had been enlarged in the process. It was then the job of Triumph's in-house engineer David Ely to turn the Fury into a running prototype, using as many off-the-shelf components as possible. The windscreen surround appears to be the same as the Spitfire and TR4 and 5, but all of the outer panels had to be handmade, along with much of the structure. The Triumph 2000's mechanicals were used as much as possible, including the engine and McPherson strut front suspension, although the semi-trailing arm rear suspension is borrowed from the TR4. The gearbox was also taken from the TR4, and despite the obvious desirability of having overdrive installed, this didn't feature. It helps that reasonably tall gearing is fitted, with the adoption of a 3.7-to-1 differential, while predictably the brakes are discs up front and drums at the rear. The rack and pinion steering was taken from the 1300 saloon, but unique to the Fury are the steering column, prop shaft, exhaust springs and dampers, as well as the cast rear suspension arms. Carrying the development chassis number X749, the Fury was then tested by Triumph's chief test driver Fred Nicklin, along with his deputy Gordon Birtwistle, although there doesn't ever seem to have been any serious intention of putting the Fury into production. It seemed to have been little more than a styling and engineering exercise, sadly. The Fury was registered for the road, but not until 1968, which is why the registration plate doesn't tally with the car's build date. When Triumph registered the car, it wore the registration shown here, which is TVT990G, but it was registered GL484 when it was acquired by the Patrick Collection. By the time the car was next sold on, it was carrying its original registration once more, which it still features. The Fury wasn't the first Triumph to feature pop-up headlights. That distinction belongs to the TRX prototype, which had arrived a full 15 years earlier in 1950. Operated by vacuum, the engine has to be running to work the mechanism, which is more complicated than most, as not only does the upper panel rise, but the lower grille section drops down like a set of jaws in action. With the Fury remaining a one-off, it would be another decade before a production Triumph featured pop-up headlights, with the arrival of the TR7. Previously a part of the Birmingham-based Patrick Collection, Jane Weitzman bought the Fury in 2009. Before she bought it, this unique Triumph was sympathetically restored by the Patrick Collection's John Ward, who repainted the car but retained the original interior as it was in pretty good condition. While the door trim panels and seats are unique to the Fury, the dash design and layout will be instantly familiar to any owner of a 60s Triumph, with its 3-spoke leather-trimmed steering wheel along with Jaeger and Smith gauges set into a wood finish panel. The driving experience is familiar too, at least from an engine and gearbox perspective. The 1998cc straight six is smooth, quiet and tractable, with its pair of Stromberg 150 CD carburetors, which deliver just 95 horsepower but a silky smooth 115 pound-feet of torque from 3000 revs. What's less familiar is the rest of the dynamic package. The more sophisticated construction means the ride is more accomplished and the handling more predictable than Triumph's production sports cars of the period, things helped by the longer wheelbase compared with the Spitfire. course, what Triumph should have done, and maybe would have done had the Fury reached production, was to fit a fuel-injected version of the 2.5 litre straight-six engine to allow up to 150 horsepower. That would have turned the Fury into a real flyer, but sadly it wasn't to be.